today's topic is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, running an arts and cultural institution, and we've been thinking about arts and culture and business and policy. But this topic really kind of encompasses both the business and policy and arts and cultural side of our program, rethinking culture in the Cultural Revolution. And I think often we think of the Cultural Revolution in China was very bleak and, probably all black and white and a lot of people's communes and so on and so forth. But I've often wondered, sometimes during times like this, there's a lot of creativity. There's a lot of collaboration, and so I know we're going to have a wonderful presentation from Professor Clark about rethinking culture, plugging in culture into the Cultural Revolution. So we're delighted to welcome him, and he is a frequent visitor to Hong Kong, and we're so glad that we have an opportunity to host tonight's program with him, and also just saw a photo of him as an exchange student in China. Thank you, Ted, for sharing that. They were classmates in 1975, and in his bio, 1974, between 74 and 79 and 76, he was an exchange student in Beijing, and also was a classmate of Ted and others that we know here in Hong Kong, like Professor Schweiger at Hong Kong UST. So it's so glad, and also another area that we hope to have Professor Clark back in the future is really talking about films. We just concluded a very successful Jewish Film Festival, again, for the third year here at Hong Kong Center. And I've often felt film is a wonderful area to understand another culture. That's how I understand. I became an American watching American movies. But I think in terms of, Professor Clark's knowledge of China and through his film would be another wonderful topic in the future. And also, just to give another plug for New Zealand is our exhibition, Picturing Asia, the photography of Brian Brake and McCurry. Brian Brake, as some of you know, is from New Zealand. He passed away in the 80s, but he was living in Hong Kong for many years. And this exhibition, Picturing Asia, is going to be traveling to Auckland, to Pop-Up Museum in February. So Professor Clark can see it here and also see it in New Zealand in February. And so those of you, you've been given tickets to see the exhibition. And also another thing that we would like to encourage, besides the ticket, please tell your friends. I think starting maybe next week, the show will be free. We will be opening it free to the public until it closes in January. So I think right now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Clark, somebody who really knows a lot about China from the 70s onward. And so Professor Clark, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you to the Asia Society for kindly inviting me to present this talk tonight, and thank you all for coming. It's nice to see some familiar old faces in the audience. I was driven to do research on the Cultural Revolution because of my own experience of the last 2 years of that period, as Ted Lipman here, also had that experience of living in Beijing in the last 2 years of the period 1966 to 76. And I remember my roommate at Beida, at Peking University, in February, I think it was, 1976, coming back to our dorm room from the world premiere of the film Breaking with Old Ideas, Juillier, since distributed by one of the Communist parties of the United States to give it a second life. But my roommate came back from the premiere of this film on a basketball court in February in Beijing. Think about it. He came back in his huge army greatcoat. He was a political instructor in the artillery in the People's Liberation Army. And he came back after this world premiere event and said, "That was a load of rubbish." That made me think. Here was someone who, when we had our political studies sessions, would speak the orthodox view of what was going on in China, would repeat the kinds of phrases that appeared in the People's Daily and everywhere else. And yet, in private, in our dorm room, he was complaining about the bitter cold he had to sit through on his little stool in a basketball court at the premiere of this new film. So here is the orthodox view of the Cultural Revolution, a period of chaos, misery, oppression, best forgotten and regarded as a cul-de-sac in Chinese developments. I think that's a view that most young Chinese, for example, today subscribe to because it's the official view of the government in Beijing today. And it's highly misleading. Here's a typical image from the Cultural Revolution, a woodblock print of wall posters. But think about it. Is this a print praising the initiatives of these workers in putting up these large character posters, Da Zibao, here? Think about how we could read that image differently. It's ridiculous. Who on earth could read, without being on a gantry, as some of the workers are at the top, who on earth could read this stuff? So there are ways to, even in something that looks highly orthodox, to question quite what is intended in some of the imagery of a period like the Cultural Revolution. My effort in writing a book on the Cultural Revolution, misleadingly called The Chinese Cultural Revolution, A History, because Cambridge University Press wouldn't allow the repetition of the word cultural in the title. It's really a cultural history of the Cultural Revolution that was published in 2008. My effort was to put culture back into the Cultural Revolution. It, after all, is called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And to put that period back into 20th century Chinese developments. It does not represent a cul-de-sac. It represents a point in a path of development, of the modernization of Chinese culture, I would argue, that continues to this day. It built upon developments that had been occurring since at least the 1910s. The 10-year period wasn't one grey period or one period of great violence, but can be divided into several periods. Frank de Kuyter, in his recent book on the Cultural Revolution, uses colours, a red period, a black period, and a grey period. I had the privilege of being there for the end of the grey period, at the end of those 10 years. There was a lot of variety and innovation and creativity from a cultural point of view reflected on stage, on screen, everywhere in these years. We should also recognize that there was a great deal going on, and I'll talk about it later, underground, away from official control and direction, that laid the seeds for considerable flourishing after 1976. And so I take an approach to the Cultural Revolution through cultural production and also, as best I can, on the consumption, on the ways in which people like my roommate muttering about this lousy film watched in frozen temperatures, how ordinary people responded, or probably responded, to much of this cultural production. Some basic points. The Cultural Revolution is traditionally labelled starting in 1966, ending in 76 with the death of Mao and the arrest of the Gang of Four. But much of the cultural production that was central in those 10 years was created before 1966, in some cases long before 1966, but continued to be recreated through the 10 years. The period, as I've just mentioned, should be differentiated into subsets of years, of times in which there was a considerable opening up and relaxation of control over cultural production and consumption. The standard joke about the Cultural Revolution, when I told people I'm writing a book about the cultural history of the Cultural Revolution, was, 800 million people watching 8 model operas. Nonsense. Speaking of model operas, one of them, or two of them, were ballets. This is The Red Detachment of Women, and I'll show how this grew out of an extremely popular feature film made or released in 1961. But these kinds of images of the Cultural Revolution are what live in people's memories today, much of them based on the film versions of the 8 model performances. Model performances, Yang Man Xi, rather than model operas. There were 5 original modernized Peking operas. 2 ballet dramas, including The Red Detachment of Women, and a symphony based on one of the model operas, Shah Jabong. All these works, these 8 model works that were at the center of cultural production and consumption for much of the Cultural Revolution, were the product of a long period of real experimentation. Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, did not suddenly appear and say, I want a model opera on this and this is how it should be done. Specialists were tasked with taking a story, often a story that had been already shown to the public in feature film version, and asked or instructed to make it work as a model opera. And there were no clear pathways or techniques that were laid down and readily available to these people to find ways to turn something into a model opera or into a modern subject opera. Several of these operas were based on films, or several of the performances were based on films. And the 2 images here, one from the Red Detachment of Women original feature film released in 1961, in which the young women soldiers in their shorts are doing their laundry in the creek, accompanied by a friendly older male cook that serves the army camp. This was converted into the ballet version of this very popular film, with the old man, or with the cook becoming a much older person, thereby removing some of the sexual tensions that are present, I think, in the original feature film. And the sequence in the ballet is where some of the young soldiers are joshing with the older man. All these works, the 8 model performances, tried to find ways to both modernize traditional performance forms, to take ballet and turn it into something that was distinctly Chinese, as it was associated very much with the Soviet Union and had only been first performed in China in the 1920s, to take ballet and make it Chinese by incorporating a whole range of Chinese theatrical movement into the new work, and also adding songs with surtitles and so on to follow the songs. So a real effort in these model works and other works over these 10 years to find ways to modernize Chinese culture. The innovation of the modernized Peking operas, 5 of them originally, was continuing a story that had begun in the 1910s with an effort to take Peking opera in particular, regarded as the national opera form, and incorporate modern subject matter with modern ideas. These kinds of modernized operas associated with the Cultural Revolution were part of that ongoing effort over several generations of opera performers. Written scripts were something new to opera performance by the 1960s. Traditionally, an opera company, an opera troupe, was led by an established actor who would decide what the repertoire was and knew the repertoire mostly it's usually him, in his memory, a kind of oral tradition of scripts. Written scripts were an innovation associated with these new style modernized operas from the 1950s onwards. There were real changes in what traditional opera audiences expected to find or to hear on stage. Role types were very well established. The martial, military brave general, the cheeky maid figures, the granny figure, the handsome young but naive scholar, the beautiful young woman. These role types were played with and experimented with in this effort to modernize Peking opera from the 1950s onwards. There were experiments made with taking tunes, musical tunes associated with particular role types, and giving them to others, because you didn't want simpering young women or beautiful young women on stage in these model operas. You wanted a young woman like the young woman on the right here in red, Li Tianmei, as one of the central characters in The Red Lantern, Hong Dengji. Specialists were brought in. There were a lot of resources devoted to making these particular model works as perfect as possible, as models for the further modernization of both Peking opera and regional opera forms. Specialists were brought in from all over: literature specialists, spoken drama, Huaju specialists, for example, specialists in lighting, in stage decoration. As you know, a traditional opera stage was pretty plain. A couple of chairs, a table, and that's it. Stage designers were brought in to design things. Film directors and film makeup specialists and lighting specialists were brought in to try and reproduce on stage with these new subject operas a kind of experience that Chinese audiences had developed a taste for in being exposed to feature films from the 1950s onwards. I'll say a bit more about that later. Well, I'll say a bit now. One good example of that is one of the pivotal scene in The Red Lantern, where the older woman there, Granny, in the middle, tells her granddaughter that in fact all three of them, father, grandmother, and daughter, are not blood relatives at all. It is an invented family, created because of the sacrifice of various revolutionaries, and that Li Tianmei's own parents are gone, and she was adopted by her father, the railway signalman with the red lantern. At the end of this opera, Li Tianmei picks up the red lantern that her father has put down prior to being shot by the Japanese. So this telling of the family history, of the real family history, that we are not a real family, was staged very carefully and experimented with at great length to try and create some of the effects that watching this on film, in a regular feature film, might have. A zoom in, as it were, to a character. So the blocking of the characters on the stage was designed, and the lighting of them was designed to try and capture something of that film watching experience. These operas were designed to reach a much wider audience than traditional opera had been reaching in the 1950s and 1960s, to people who had an opportunity to watch films from the 1950s onwards, with the great effort to make films available to a mass audience. The only one of the 5 original model operas that's set in contemporary times is On the Docks, Haigang. And this is the central character, the intimidating central character in that particular opera, the party secretary, who goes to great length to educate a young man in the ways of the revolution. Here are the young man and his colleagues on the docks in a strangely green version of their picture. And a more successful one of the original 5 operas is Shah Jabong, which draws upon the Jianghu, the rivers and lakes tradition of popular culture, of Chinese popular culture, which of course infests the whole martial arts tradition that we're so familiar with in Hong Kong movies. Shah Jabong was rather successful with audiences because it drew on these older interests of mass audiences, readers and watchers in China. And just some more film stills from these works. Each of these model works was carefully, and this means spending 3, 4, 5 years, carefully committed to celluloid. The object of the exercise, as with traditional opera, was to produce perfect performances. There was no interest in surprise or change in characters necessarily, or development of characters necessarily, or in surprising plot twists. The interest was in seeing a perfect performance. That's a traditional opera interest, and it was transposed in a way, to a large degree, to these modernized operas, and committing these, by the early 1970s, perfected scripts and perfected performances into perfect film versions, was the task of people like Xie Tieli and Xie Jin, both of whom had been condemned for films they'd produced before the Cultural Revolution in the mid-1960s, and yet they were given the task in the late 1960s, early 1970s, of making these perfected film versions of the two model operas, 1, 2, and the model ballet here, the white-haired girl on the bottom. We should remember that these model works were everywhere, which was true of films, in particular after 1949 and through till the 1980s. A film did not just live in a cinema shown to an audience. A film lived beyond the cinema, particularly from the soundtrack, the musical score, the songs of a film could be played over radio, over loudspeakers, on railway carriages, on long railway journeys, and so forth, and be reproduced in posters like this to inspire younger generation, or be converted into comic books for young readers or less literate readers to enjoy and become familiar with. Changes in the 1970s should not be overlooked. There's a tendency, as I noted at the beginning, of thinking about the Cultural Revolution as one 10-year grey period of chaos, suffering, misery, and that's it. From about 1971, late 71, after the fall of Lin Biao, Mao's supposed successor, things opened up a great deal. The Peking operas provided models for local opera forms, Sichuan opera, Shanghai opera, Cantonese opera, and even Uyghur musicals to be modernized themselves. Old periodicals, like the most popular magazine that there was in China, Dazhong Dianying, mass cinema or mass film, were republished, began publication again after a 5 or 6 year hiatus, and new ones emerged too, all over the place. Regional publications began to flourish in the 1970s, reproducing a whole lot of new writing and new art being created right across the country. There was continuing experimentation with particularly modernizing folk performance, of finding a Chinese way to modernity. And that's really a way to understand cultural production during these 10 years, is finding a Chinese route to modernization in culture and the arts. There were a widening range of productions, so that people just weren't confined to operas and the occasional ballet, but ballet itself began to be experimented with. Duets, rather than massed dramas filled with huge corps de ballet, were created and performed across the regions. And these two stills are from one of the last of the modernized Peking operas of the Cultural Revolution period, Boulder Bay, Pan Shi Wan. And this is the film version of this opera. Two stills. The one on the left is the opening sequence of the filmed version. It was actually filmed in nature, in the real world. These are the central heroine and her mother-in-law arriving by boat at the fishing village where this opera is set. It's a spy story about people's militia on the southeast coast, in Fujian somewhere, fighting off spies from Taiwan. The more striking aspect of this new opera, first performed in 1975, is on the right, in the right-hand picture. The central hero here is holding his child. In the original model operas of the Cultural Revolution from the mid-1960s, the central characters had no families, or they had an invented revolutionary family like the threesome in Red Lantern. Here is an actual real, more real human being with a young baby and a wife who occasionally complains about her mother-in-law. I mean, this is an effort to take these model works and these kinds of super impressive heroic figures and humanize them more, to make them closer to real people. The whole film version of this opera, I've argued in a paper, was also different from the original 5 model operas committed to film in the early 1970s. This effort uses techniques of ordinary feature films to perhaps take the audience closer to the characters, these really humanized characters with babies and mothers-in-law and so on, than the original model operas of the early Cultural Revolution period. I've also touched in the book briefly on architecture. This isn't probably a very good example of trying to modernize Chinese folk forms, but it will do to note in passing as architecture is part of culture. Now I want to talk about 2 things. One is the importance of film in these 10 years, something close to my heart, but I think also important to note. And the other, to end tonight, I'll say something about underground or fully unofficial cultural production and consumption efforts. This is one of my favorite Cultural Revolution woodblock prints. It shows a member of a mobile projection team showing the film The Red Lantern, Hong Dang-ji, to some fishing people somewhere on the south coast, I guess. Film was central to the Cultural Revolution and to the pleasures of the Cultural Revolution. Now, isn't that an interesting phrase? The pleasures of the Cultural Revolution, as opposed to the suffering and destruction of the Cultural Revolution. There certainly was suffering and destruction, and I would not wish to deny that or downplay that. But there were also moments where people could enjoy themselves. And films were very much part of those enjoyments. The model opera films, or the model performance films, the Yang Banxi films, were first released. The first of them was released in October 1970. They were released from 1970 to 1973, by which time new feature films were being shown. Films that, in some cases, recreated older films. The Nanzheng Beizhan film here is from 1952, one of the favorite films of the early 50s, was remade in full color, widescreen, in 1974. Ho-hum, but new feature films very soon also expanded to new films, completely new films. During the Cultural Revolution years, people will tell you they were watching only 3 films. This is one of the absolutes of the Cultural Revolution memories that people say, which is so utterly misleading. But people will say, there were only 3 films being shown. Lao San Zhan, the old 3 battles. One of them was Nanzheng Beizhan. One of them was Dilei Zhan, mine warfare, and one was Didao Zhan, tunnel warfare. Yes, they were shown over and over again, and there's a marvelous sequence in Jiang Wen's film In the Heat of the Sun, made in the mid-1990s, about Cultural Revolution from a different point of view. In that film, we see a massed audience watching outdoors one of the Lao San Zhan and repeating the dialogue ahead of time because it is so utterly familiar. But meanwhile, there were also older films that supposedly were banned. In the usual accounts of the Cultural Revolution say that, if they mention culture at all, will say that all cultural productions before 1966 were banned. Yes, but they needed to be studied carefully for their negative teaching example, Famian Jiaocai, And so you could, if you were lucky, get hold of a ticket or an opportunity to see one of these condemned films. And of course, afterwards perhaps mouth appropriate slogans about how vicious and nasty this was, while in the darkness of the cinema, you could enjoy the pleasure of watching this fondly remembered older film. Foreign films were also a big hit in China, and one of the best examples of that was this film here in the Chinese redoing of it. It was dubbed, as all foreign films were dubbed into Chinese, but this is the Changchun's version of The Flower Seller or The Flower Girl, a huge hit in the DPRK, which was released in China twice, once in a regular version and then in 1974 in coloured version. And people have told me about lines stretching around blocks outside cinemas in Beijing when this film was released in both of these years. A huge hit, an opportunity to see something exotic on film in these years, to fly beyond China's borders, as it were, and see something else. One of the most popular of the new style films released from 1973 onwards was this film, Sparkling Red Star, Shan Shan de Hongxing. And this is a poster based on the film where Winter Boy, Pan Dongzi there on the left, serves as inspiration to young Chinese. Again, an example of the ways in which film was central in cultural life in the period, and where a film could have a life way beyond simply being screened in cinemas. The two songs from this film were immensely popular, as was the film itself. This particular image, I'm afraid I don't have a colour version of it, but she is wearing bright red silk, a bright red silk costume. This particular image seemed to occur in lots of male dormitories across schools and factories in China that Ted and I were visiting over those years. I'll leave you to work out perhaps why. But I'm talking about the pleasures of the Cultural Revolution, remember. Oops. So to end, what about unofficial cultural production in the Cultural Revolution? This is usually associated with the sent-down youth, the zhiqing. These young people, about 22 million people sent down to the countryside after December 1968 to learn from the peasants or to become soldiers or to work in mining areas and so forth. These young people, especially on communes with the agricultural cycle, had the space and the time often to write, to sing, and so forth. There was a common practice to take a well-known song, a well-known official song, and of course create your own lyrics, which usually undermined the message of the official version of the tune. Likewise, older tunes were sung, foreign songs were sung because people took their old books or smuggled their old books from their city homes to their new homes in the countryside. The effort by most of these 22 million to get back to their city homes was legendary, and part of the attraction of returning home, either officially or even in some cases unofficially, was the rise of so-called salons in urban spaces in Beijing, associated with the railway ministry housing compound, with the Foreign Affairs housing compound, for example, and in other major cities, where people could come and talk about their cultural interests, about their experimentations that they might have been doing in the countryside, and share them with others. These emerged quite early in the Cultural Revolution and flourished despite images of everything being tightly controlled and dangerous. during the Cultural Revolution. And underground hand-copying fiction and poetry was widely circulated amongst sent-down youth across the country. In one case, The Second Handshake was a novel which was given its title not by the original author, but by one of the people who hand-copied a version of the story to circulate it amongst his friends. And this underground effort very much laid the groundwork for the flourishing of Chinese culture and the new directions in Chinese painting, music, art in general, after 1976 with the fall of the Gang of Four and then the later turn to opening up. The experience of these young people in being culturally productive and enjoying these new cultural productions very much laid a foundation for developments that have emerged since those times and over the 40 years since. Oh, a plug, sorry. This one, the most recent, don't want to see that. This one covers 1968, 1988, and 2008, trying to show the continuities and the ways in which in 1968 young people were using culture to create their own identity, to assert their own spaces, their own views of the world, their differences from older generations, just as people did in 1988 with the invention of Chinese rock music and so forth, and in 2008 as they plunged into the world of the internet. And is this the way it ends? Most unfortunate. I used to have a little more hair than I did now. Yes, this is the last slide. There is the soldier who sat through the world premiere of Breaking with Old Ideas in February 1976 on a basketball court at Peking University and came back muttering about how dreadful the film was. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, we're going to open up to questions from the audience. Okay, right here.
Professor Clark, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask how you describe the concept of red culture, 红色文化, to your students or in your research. I'm afraid I haven't had the pleasure of reading your books yet. I'm asking this question because many of my students at the University of Hong Kong are fascinated with contemporary red tourism, but they're really not sure what to make of 红色文化 then and now.
What a difficult question. There's a lot of nostalgia associated with the Cultural Revolution. Hence the attractions today of 红色文化, of redness in various forms, including these silly restaurants and so forth. But nostalgia is a major motivating force. It's a motivating force, I think, in my own interest in writing about the Cultural Revolution and researching it and trying to go deeper. It becomes a kind of shorthand for before and after. The Cultural Revolution now serves as a very useful before to the achievements and the growth and development since reform and opening up after 1978. Remember those old ads for, was it Charles Atlas or something? The skinny kid before and then the hulking muscle-bound man afterwards. The Cultural Revolution is that before image. And so interest in 红色文化 now, in red culture now, is kind of also can be read as a kind of resistance, as a reminder of the relative simplicity of those days. And by simplicity, one can also mean cleanliness, or what's the word, non-corrupt nature of those years. So in a way, an interest in these kinds of red culture can be an indirect way of pointing out the failures of the present regime, of the after, as it were.
Okay, another question, next.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I understand one of your research interests is those fifth generations directors of Chinese cinema, and for those directors who grew up during the Cultural Revolution, what do you think that experience have shaped or affected their artistic vision?
Don't get me started. That's a whole book. I think it was crucial. The kinds of artists that became the fifth generation filmmakers were typical of a fraction of those 22 million sent down youth who had the time and made the effort or had the inclination to think about why on earth they were there, stuck in the countryside, without completing their high school education, let alone their tertiary education. That questioning of what's wrong with the system that has exiled us away from our families, away from, or have sent our parents off to a newpang, a cowshed or something. What's wrong with the system that has stuck us here in this countryside? And why is the political system like this? So there was a lot of thinking and rethinking and questioning going on amongst, I think, a fraction, a small proportion of those millions of sent down youth. Now, those few who got into the Beijing Film Academy in 1978 then gained the tools, the technical tools, in which to present their new thinking on screen. And this whole generation that had grown up in the 50s and early 60s knew the power of film, because so much effort went into making film the sort of the central cultural activity in Chinese life after 1949. And so they remembered fondly their own film experiences and saw that film could be used to present their new thinking after they graduated in 1982 from the Film Academy. But those years of thinking during the Cultural Revolution didn't apply to all sent down youth by any means. But that thinking, I think, was crucial to bring them with new ideas and wanting to use new techniques, new film techniques, to present to Chinese audiences.
Over here.
I noticed that one of your research is from the Red Guards to Netizen from 1968, 88 to 2008. So it's 8 years, almost a decade from the last observation. And we have seen the growth of the 50 cents party in China's internet, the so-called Wu Mao Dang, and also an army of they are called 小粉红, the small pinkies. They are they are not paid, they don't get the 50 cents, but they are nationalistic. They are proud of China being a strong state, and they may even make up a cyber army and watch the boards of Tsai Ing-wen or the party in Taiwan. On Facebook, they climb over the Great Firewall. I would like to know what's your observation after 2008, and do you think this little pinkies, the nationalistic young netizens of China nowadays, are closer to Red Guards? What do you think the makings of them, and what's their role in today's China, especially when the current leader emphasized so much on cyber sovereignty?
That's a huge, difficult question. The hardest part of
I think we need another talk for that.
Indeed.
But still, please.
The hardest part of writing that book was the 2008 period, just trying to get to grips in 2008, which is about 8 years ago with the internet. I mean, I was crazy to even try and attempt that. And since then, of course, WeChat and so forth has emerged hugely. But the internet continues to be a space in which people can, not anonymously, but can connect with others. And they can do things, as you suggest, expressing nationalist sentiments. They can play with word games and so forth to express a degree of resistance and climb over the firewall, which I think is sometimes overlooked, that there's a whole army of people trying to control internet use, but they are generally failing in that mission today. But young people and nationalism, the internet has given people much greater power to connect with others, and that can be used perhaps for good or for ill. It also has given the party state much more power to connect with its people. We shouldn't overlook the uses to which government organizations at all levels use the internet. So it's a very complicated picture. I would not associate young Chinese nationalists expressing views on the internet today with Red Guards back in 1966 to any great degree. Both perhaps have some rebellious streak in them and wanting to assert a sense of separateness from parents and others, but it's a bit of a stretch to stretch over 50 years like that.
Any other questions? Over there.
Thank you, Professor Clark. I have a question about foreign influence or foreign film influence during the Cultural Revolution, especially on the periphery. You mentioned the DPRK film that showed up, and recently there have been books about how prolific the North Korean film industry was at that time. But what about Soviet cinema? What about Hong Kong on the periphery? It seems like it would seep in somehow, but...
Not really. I mean, remember, we're talking about the days before the video. Remember the videotape, the VCR? Some of us are old enough to remember that. 1966 to 76 was before even the VCR, so it was harder. Soviet films might be watched as negative teaching examples, as these films to be criticized and learned from, but secretly enjoyed in the dark. In these 10 years, the sources of most foreign films were Albania, not exactly noted as a world film center, Albania, North Korea, and possibly Yugoslavia, I think, as the three biggest numbers. But other foreign films, including Soviet films and others, were circulated for criticism. And I think we might think this might only happen occasionally, once a year people might see a naughty film or a film that had been banned. In fact, it was more frequent than that for some people who had access to particular work units and so forth. It was a quite frequent occurrence to go and enjoy quietly these films in the dark. I've written about the importance of film in the Cultural Revolution in a recent chapter, and I called it Singing in the Dark.
Okay, one question in the back.
Okay, I just want to like to know that what do you mean that Cultural Revolution has not finished?
Oh, that I think I was being foolish when I was preparing the PowerPoint slide a few weeks ago before I spent the last 2 weeks in Beijing. To a degree, perhaps the Cultural Revolution happened after the Cultural Revolution. That the real revolution came in the 1980s and 1990s, when people's lives were, at least materially, greatly transformed by the widening of choices available to them in terms of entertainment, of spare time. I mean, the rise of spare time is something I'm interested in. My next book will be a study of leisure and urban space in Beijing since 1949 until now. So I'm particularly interested in the transformation of spare time and the emergence of the idea of having spare time in the 1980s, when there were much more choices and foreign cultural influences really flooded in to a degree much greater than had been the case in the 50s and 60s.
More question out of ignorance. Was there anybody in the leadership of at the time of the Cultural Revolution who took a particular interest in modern film? Like Stalin or Hitler or these people, they had a particular affinity? Was there somebody leading in a way?
Well, step forward, Jiang Qing, Mrs. Mao, Madame Mao. Jiang Qing, of course, a former film actress from the 1930s in Shanghai, before she went to Yan'an and married Chairman Mao. Jiang Qing was particularly interested in the power, or knew the power of film, and also, I think, had considerable awareness of staging. I mean, often accounts of the production of these and refinement of these model operas and ballets during the Cultural Revolution feature a condemnation of Jiang Qing for interfering in the development of the works, when in fact some of her comments, if you look at them objectively, were really quite clever. She knew how things could be staged better or more effectively to move an audience or to engage an audience. And she knew film and was particularly interested in film. And the biography by Roxanne Whitkey that has been largely ignored in recent years makes the point that she was at the end of a wide stream of foreign films pouring in for her consumption and for the consumption of other film specialists, the professional consumption of film specialists right during these years.
Okay. All right. Over here.
You mentioned, Paul, during the 1960s model performances, that these were modernizing ideas. What were those ideas?
That instead of generals or feudal figures, the word feudal should never be used regarding dynastic China, but people do, that these feudal figures of the traditional operas needed to be challenged by younger figures, for example, who knew what's what and had a real commitment to the revolution and wanted to overthrow establishment figures. So these kinds of new ideas of reversal of roles and so on were behind efforts, some of the efforts to modernize these operas. But also it was simply an effort that had been going on since the 1910s to present modern stories, 20th century stories, on the opera stage. Opera was hugely popular amongst ordinary people, particularly amongst rural people, and yet it continued through to the mid-1960s to be, that stage continued to be populated by these ancient generals, emperors, and weakling scholars, and simpering beauties, and cheeky maids and clowns. This was an effort to relate what was on stage to the lives or the recent historical experience of the people watching these operas.
Thank you. You mentioned the reaction of the PLA guy here you've got on the photo. Mm-hmm. What was your impression of the general population? Were they buying into the message of these stories and the operas and the films, or were they cynical, or did they buy some of it or all of it? Or
it's impossible to know, but one has a feel. I cited my roommates grumbling. One has a feel that, throughout the 2 years I was there, that there was a distinction between how people performed in public and performed their loyalty, as it were, in public, and what they said in private. And I think that's true of the cultural productions of the Cultural Revolution. There were pleasures to be gained from them. The perfection of those performances, the enthusiasm, people had enthusiasm for these performances and for these performers, even after a great deal of familiarity with these operas. They were just so beautifully made, so well presented, and so interesting in their diversion from the traditional forms that people remained generally engaged with them, I would argue, and enjoying them, possibly for their own reasons. But meanwhile, there was also a degree of cynicism, of course, particularly by the mid-1970s, as things became just too familiar.
One last question. Do we have somebody here? Okay. If not, I'm going to ask you one question regarding music. Around the time you mentioned videotape, and there was none, at that time, but cassette tape started to. Because when did the Teresa Tang? We showed a film.
Yes.
But that seemed to be the beginning of music from, all of a sudden, Teresa Tang music was one of the singer from Taiwan, became seeping in. It became really popular around that time,
late
70s.
Late 70s.
Okay.
So it was seeping in, but very few people had access to cassette decks. I think I had a cassette deck, and people would bring tapes to play. But it's really after the end of the death of Mao and the rest of the Gang of Four that really took hold. But I remember I had a little $5 Sony transistor radio, and I remember turning it on, I think in April 1976, and hearing Jimmy Carter, presidential nomination candidate for the Democratic Party, talking on the Voice of America from my $5 Sony transistor radio. I was not alone, I'm sure, in hearing these foreign voices and foreign music in 1976.
On that interesting presidential note, a couple of decades later, we have another presidential candidate coming up in inaugurating soon, but we won't. Well, there'll be another subject, but I just want to remind you, we have a wonderful program. Professor Lin is going to talk about Taiwan, her new book, I think next week. So those of you who can join us, please join us. But thank you, Professor Clark, for that thoughtful, really interesting discussion about culture in the Cultural Revolution. And I look forward to having you back. And one of the dreams that I always had, now we have this beautiful theater, is really to do kind of like a comparative film. What were they watching in 1973 in China, and what were we watching here in Hong Kong or in Taiwan? I thought that would be a really interesting series, and maybe you can help us curate a film series like that, because it's a wonderful way to kind of understand China, Greater China, or Asia back then. So stay tuned. All these program ideas we're discussing, and we just need to find funding for it. So, okay. Thank you all for coming. And Professor Clark, thank you on behalf of Asia Society for a really thoughtful presentation. Little book. Thank you.